2024 will be the largest election year in history, with almost 50% of the global population going to the polls to have their say in who is going to lead their respective countries. Now, obviously, some votes had more say than others, and many of these elections were as good as decided before the first vote was cast, though this still represents a trend that the world is generally moving in the direction of democracy, which is, obviously, overwhelmingly, a good thing. But it does have its problems. And with a particularly globally influential and contentious election just around the corner, yes, of course, I'm talking about Uzbekistan, it's important to understand the impacts these systems of representative government can have on our economies. Even if they are conducted completely fairly, which of course they often aren't, elections inherently add a lot of uncertainty around everything from trade deals to tax rates and even the severity by which legal enforcement is implemented. This becomes especially true the further political objectives are divided between the candidates' parties. This is all to say nothing of the tricks that incumbent governments will use to make their economic performance seem better than it really might be for just long enough to get elected, often coming at a very tangible cost in the long term. Democracy really is the worst form of government, apart from all the alternatives. But understanding these limitations can genuinely make the peaceful transfer of power less of a disruptive exercise, and the best way to mitigate these tricks is to just understand them. So, what impacts do elections have on national economies? When has this actually become a very serious issue? And finally, can these disturbances be minimised? Before we dive in, let me share something that keeps me focused and energised while researching these fascinating topics. When I'm in deep focus mode, diving into the complexities of global economies like Thailand's, I sometimes forget about easy but crucial things like drinking enough water throughout the day to stay hydrated. That's where today's sponsor Element comes into play. Element is a zero sugar electrolyte drink mix with everything you need and nothing you don't. It provides the electrolytes your body needs, sodium, potassium and magnesium, without any added sugar, artificial ingredients or colouring. It's a healthy alternative to sugary electrolyte drinks and it's trusted by many Olympic athletes, including the USA weightlifting team and even by the Navy SEALs. Proper hydration is key to everyone, whether you're pushing your physical limits just as the Olympic athletes, travelling a lot, or just trying to stay focused and having enough energy during the day. I like to keep a stack of packets on my desk to help me stay hydrated throughout the day. If you want to try Element, right now they're offering a free sample pack of all 8 flavours with any purchase. Best of all, it's risk-free. If you don't love it, they'll refund your order, no questions asked. To get your free sample, go to drinkelement.com/economicsexplained or click the link in the description. Okay, before we get into the details, it's time to give the patented big disclaimer. This video and this channel tend to avoid politics as much as possible when addressing economics, so we won't be advocating for one party over another outside of using this as a case study to show how economics is, for better or worse, used as a political tool and the consequences that that can have. Also, to be completely transparent, in the words of the great Michael Jordan, Republicans watch YouTube too. Anyway, with that out of the way, avoiding political influence on economies is next to impossible. At the very least, the government controls fiscal policy, bailouts, subsidies, competition laws, advertising standards, and tariffs, so no matter how free a market purports to be, the government does inevitably have immense influence over even the smallest details of the way that we interact with things of value. In the US in 2022, federal spending was equal to 23% of total GDP, a share that has grown almost tenfold over the last century, apart from a brief blip between 1943 and 1945. Not sure what happened there. For most people, this isn't much of a surprise. The government and the wider economy share an increasingly close relationship. It's nothing the average person worries about, that is, until these systems are about to come under new management. This issue becomes especially bigly the more divisive and polarising the campaigns are. If, for example, one party has strong worker protection objectives while their opponents are running on a corpo platform of zero minimum wages and corporate taxes, this can paralyse otherwise functional businesses as they will find it increasingly difficult to make decisions based on such an uncertain future. If businesses don't know what the policy landscape is going to look like, they can't invest confidently into new projects, and a slowdown in business investment has wider impacts on general growth, employment, and even inflation. Of course, this is an extreme example, but elections as uncertain as this happen around the world all the time. To be fair though, the US election, which is of course getting most of the attention at the moment, doesn't have as severe differences in economic policy as something like Argentina's earlier in the year, because generally, their economy is doing better, so it's more about fine-tuning than radical readjustments. But there are still issues like trade, something that could really go either way with the current candidates, particularly when it comes to something like tariffs. A tax on imported goods is not a novel move in a place like the US, and recent scenarios aren't the most extreme in the country's history. The Ford-Macumber Act in the 1920s raised the average import tax to 40% to help the agricultural industry. The results were less than positive. Domestic prices rose, and even back then it had global consequences. Countries in Europe had trouble paying off their post-war debts, while others gave up altogether, which famously ended super fantastically for everyone. And yet, given the right circumstances, tariffs can arguably come with a handful of benefits. Depending on the niche, it might help domestic producers and industries to outcompete international distributors in high employment fields like agriculture, manufacturing, as well as those seen to be strategically important for objectives beyond strictly economics, like military manufacturing, energy independence, and more recently chip manufacturing. Beyond saving jobs and local capabilities, it can also be used as an effective geopolitical tool to bring countries to the negotiating table. The most extreme application of this being outright sanctions, which are really just a severe trade restriction. But it always comes with a series of risks, including the dropping of supply of domestic products that need internationally traded materials, and damages to the supply chain that can last for decades, removing local leverage companies might have when negotiating a fair price, and long term, the big issue is removing the very competition that fuels economic advancement. Tariffs might protect businesses and employment in the local market, but even the US will struggle to stop other countries from buying the cheapest international supplier. BYD is now one of the world's largest electric vehicle manufacturers, and if plug-in hybrids are included, they already hold the crown. But thanks to heavy import tariffs, they basically don't exist in the US market, because after the tax is added, the end price would no longer be competitive with other EV manufacturers, Tesla obviously being the big one. The benefit here is that Tesla can continue to sell cars and employ US workers without having to compete with a Chinese manufacturer, which can employ much cheaper workers, and to be fair, has a long list of its own government protections. The problem is without this drive to compete, there's not much to incentivise these protected businesses to lower prices or offer a better product, which means in international markets, they lose ground, hurting exports. I've already mentioned it before, but here in Australia, BYD cars have become extremely common almost overnight, and no amount of tariffs between the US and China is going to stop Australian consumers from just buying the cheapest EV or hybrid offered to them. Now, this has kind of already happened before. The US auto industry was heavily protected from Japan as it started to emerge as a major manufacturer in the 1970s. These cheap Japanese cars were heavily taxed, which meant there was little incentive for legacy US automakers to improve their designs. Eventually, Japanese automakers were not only making cheaper cars than the Americans, they were also making better cars than them, which allowed them to become a major global export competitor. Ironically, policies designed to protect US automakers ended up incubating foreign automakers. And look, of course, almost every country has trade restrictions, it's not inherently good or evil to apply them. The key issue to focus on here is that elections like the one in 2024 that radically impact economic policy often create an unhelpful smokescreen for any industry in need of a reliable long-term plan. The point is, towards the end of a term, without the ability to adjust, domestic operations just don't know if they can source components or trade freely. It's paralysing. If elections are more predictable, even a stable anti-business government can often be preferable to the unknown, because then at least businesses can invest in domestic manufacturing without the risk of a shift in the economy where they'd be unable to adapt at the same pace. With a lot of uncertainties, businesses and individuals just hold off to see what happens, slowing down economic activity, and this can be seen happening in many economies around the world today. Now, of course, there are lots of reasons for this, but as recently as July, employment fell short of many economists' expectations in the USA. What was predicted to be 185,000 hirings ended up only being 114,000. The situation has since rebounded, but many are interpreting this as a sign of what is to come. Even though the US economy continues to grow, the slowdown has resulted in a notable drop in consumer confidence. And this is a rational response. There's a common pattern people in democratic countries witness during an election season: the life support strategy. The US Federal Reserve is usually defined as an entity independent within the government. It has its own board of directors, 12 regional reserve banks, and if it's operating the way it's supposed to be, almost complete political autonomy. Its position in politics, however, has been questioned from time to time over the last century, with US leadership on both sides of the aisle constantly pushing the envelope to see how much they can influence major policy decisions for the rest of the country. The most notable case involved Richard Nixon and his appointed Fed chair Arthur Burns, which was one of the more controversial collaborations in the Fed's history. And toward the end of the term, with the possibility of re-election of an individual party with the same views, the Federal Reserve usually received an extreme amount of pressure from the president to cut interest rates in an effort to spur economic growth. This isn't necessarily a bad decision, but if government fiscal policy can't be above politics, the Fed really needs to be, because playing around with the cash rate to score political points can and has caused hyperinflation, and the complete wipeout of currencies in dozens of countries across the world, even since the turn of the new millennium. Beyond the interest rates, incumbent governments do a number of other things to try and sell the idea that everything is just fine. They can take on more debt to launch unsustainable programs, they can greenlight poorly thought out and unaffordable infrastructure projects, or of course, they can just cut taxes. All of these decisions can seriously damage the economy long term, but effective branding of these goals can be enough to get another term in office, regardless of the probable outcome down the line. But when someone like the sitting president is on their way out without the possibility of re-election, the situation can arguably be more complicated with the problems caused by a lame duck, an elected official whose successor has already been elected, or will be soon, and therefore doesn't have much of an influence over the government, or as much of an incentive to tackle major issues. Politically, this can result in something like the 19th century failure of James Buchanan, who did absolutely nothing to stop the South's secession from the Union, believing that the decision to separate was unconstitutional, but also that it was unconstitutional to interfere, which led to the bloodiest domestic conflict in US history. Economically, there's President Hoover, who tried to collaborate with FDR over policies to rectify the Great Depression, which didn't go well, and probably contributed to the prolonged stagnation of the economy. Or more recently, George W. Bush and the 2008 financial crisis. Now, the policies that deregulated banking to the point where this crisis became as big as it did in 2008 were their own economic failures. But the resulting crisis really kicked off right at the tail end of Bush's last term, when the campaign for 2 new presidential candidates was well and truly underway. Ultimately, it was going to be one of these 2 men that was going to inherit the crisis and be responsible for overseeing the policies to fix it. This meant that Bush couldn't make the kinds of decisive moves that were probably warranted at a time like this, further adding to the confusion of the global economy collapsing. To make matters worse, the 2 candidates to replace Bush were both senators at the time, so they would also have to balance prudent economic policy decisions with what would look good for their election campaign. Now, fortunately, what made this time period particularly unique is that the competing presidential candidates, Barack Obama and John McCain, actually suspended their campaigns to deal with the problem and formulate policy while the lame duck president was still in office. At least for a moment, the 2 politicians, with considerably different views on the country's future, came together to make the transition smoother for whoever ended up taking office. But there was a lot of resistance, with many arguing that this was a political stunt, which made it hard to make any real changes until the new president was elected. Regardless of the outcome and the headbutting between them that soon followed, the need for this unprecedented cooperation was a clear demonstration that the economic controls of a nation that increasingly lie with the government aren't always as well helmed as they probably should be. So whether it's trade, the life support strategy, or the occasional lame duck, elections have a way of creating an unsettling level of uncertainty. However, there are ways that these disturbances can be minimised. When looking at the system itself, whether it be the aforementioned Nixon incident or any other leader with an interest in the Fed, the primary lesson is that central bank independence is incredibly important. Without the ability to operate freely, elections wouldn't be the only thing keeping participants from making sound decisions, and this has been a widely held global philosophy over the last 3 decades. Following these clear rules, however, has often proven difficult. One country that tried to challenge this rule was Turkey, an economy we've discussed at length in 2 recent videos, and not for good reasons. Without diving too much into what's already been covered, a constitutional overhaul led to a rise in presidential power over their central bank, specifically interest rates, where the governors overseeing the Turkish central bank were fired in quick succession for suggesting rate hikes to curb the inflation crisis. There were many other issues that led to Turkey's current battle for stability, but ideological pressure on a banking system that relies on independence definitely haven't helped its ongoing recovery process, resulting in lasting damage to an institution dedicated to stabilising a country's economy. On a broader scale, the US and most other advanced economies around the world have a lot of differences with Turkey, but it's also foolish to assume that they are special or above these issues. This current, very divisive election is why the second way to mitigate the impact of these factors is perhaps the most important of them all. Just be informed. More informed voters are harder to pull these tricks on, which ultimately means more stable elections and economic decision making. It forces candidates to focus on the most pressing issues that everyone, regardless of their respective affiliation, truly care about. In your role, politicians seeking power in an election cycle will do anything and offer everything in an effort to secure a vote. The democratic process is far from perfect. It gives power to the people who can convince the people that their ideas are better, and the best way to make sure these ideas are realistic and also good is just to understand them. Nobody can predict the outcome of an election or its future impact, least of all economists, but there's a prevailing truth in the realm of politics and its influence over the economy. People are less likely to deceive as long as everyone in the world is watching. Thanks for watching, mate. Please clap.